surveillance, democracy, and the state. Three heavy concepts. We have about a little bit more than an hour to really address all the problems involved here. This panel is also emerged out of that research project that Antonella mentioned before on the IRIS project, Increasing Resilience in Surveillance Society. And I'm the coordinator of this project. My name is Reinhard Kreissl, and I'm trying to get this project, keep this project together. And I will be the chair. I'm the person who holds up these signs. Chiara Fonio is on the right end. She will be. No, actually, I'm the chair. You're the moderator. I'm the chair.
Yeah.
So I'm holding up these things, and Chiara will moderate. And we had 4 speakers in this panel. Unfortunately, one of the speakers, Clive Norris, became seriously sick, so he will not be with us here today, which then, on the other hand, has the advantage that the 3 speakers that are left have a little bit more time to present their point. And we will proceed in the order of courtesy and start with ladies first. I'll start with Rowena. Rowena is from Trilateral Research, and she's a PhD in law from the University of Edinburgh. And she will talk about the relation between the surveillance industry and the state in Europe, and try to look at this from different sides. Then there will be Ben Hayes. Ben Hayes is from your views on the left side, on my right side. Ben is studied geography. Most of you will know him because he's also the director of Statewatch, and has worked in the Civil Liberties Organization for quite some time and published on civil liberties, and has a very critical perspective on the relation between the surveillance industry or the military surveillance complex and the public sphere and democratic rights. And he will tell us something about the financial surveillance complex on AML, CFT, and human rights. So as you can see, we're trying to combine two perspectives. The one is, okay, everybody knows surveillance is a bad thing, so we don't have to talk about that. But maybe surveillance has some good features or some positive elements to it as well. And this is what we're going to address, or trying to address this ambiguity or multidimensionality, however you want to call it. And then there's Roger, who will be the last speaker on our panel today. Roger Clarke, who is a consultant in management of information and information technology. He received his education in the University of New South Wales in Australia, and holds a doctorate degree from the Australian National University. There are always these funny T-shirts, and that is say in Austria. There are no kangaroos in Austria, so he's an Australian. I'm a German. I'm from Austria, but he's from Australia. Okay, right? So Roger is very active as a consultant and also has an academic career. And he will give a more general overview, and the title of his paper will be The State Surveillance and Its Governance. So please, Rowena, go ahead. And you don't have 10 minutes, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Reinhard. My presentation today aims to give you a bit more food for thought and something to take away in relation to the relationship of the EU surveillance industry and the state. So we first start with, let's take a look at the surveillance industries, who are the key players, solutions, and the drivers. We have a variety of surveillance solutions, and we have a variety of surveillance companies that offer these solutions and a variety of more solutions. We have surveillance solutions that are specific to the public sector. There are surveillance solutions specific to the private sector or commercial applications. And then we have solutions that are tailored towards individuals, which I think we forgot to mention in the course of the day today. But what are the factors that drive the surveillance industry? And as we see, there are a number of factors. There's legislation, there's policy that supports surveillance, there is research and innovation that takes place in industry. finances and funding that goes to support surveillance-based research and investment by big security companies in developing new surveillance solutions. And then we have the profits that come from investing into surveillance solutions. Then we also have the fact that positive media coverage boosts the demand for surveillance solutions. And then again, we have the public demand for surveillance solutions. Moving on, what are the features of the surveillance industry? Now, we need to understand this if we are to understand the scope of the industry and how it affects other stakeholders in terms of its relationship with the state or its relationship with us. The first feature is there are a vast diversity of companies in terms of organizational history, size, location, and in terms of the employment they provide. And in terms of the solutions they offer, some companies focus on very specific type of solutions. Others offer a broad variety of solutions. Then we have a variety of solutions. As I mentioned before, we have the government sector solutions, like solutions catering to civil and military applications, and we have the commercial or civil applications, and we have the solutions tailored for maybe individuals, which are of more smaller scale. Then the EU surveillance industry does not just concentrate on the EU. It is in a process of constant expansion and providing surveillance solutions elsewhere in the world, specifically America, as well as emerging markets like Asia and Africa. The surveillance industry is characterized by a profit-driven nature, and Ben has excellently talked about this in his previous work, that profits drive the surveillance industry. There is a huge public sector demand for surveillance solutions, and it is constantly growing. And it is a driver of the investment into surveillance solutions by traditional security companies are using a lot of this demand to boost their surveillance portfolios. The industry is also characterized by strategic partnerships and collaborations between big surveillance companies, small surveillance companies, and industry associations, as well as research institutions and academia. Another feature of the industry is acquisitions and mergers. This is a very strong feature, as surveillance companies see this as a bolt-on feature to add to their market position and to boost their edge or leadership of the market. Then we see there is a variety of non-EU players who are competing in the EU surveillance market. And in the survey that we conducted during the IRIS project, we looked at over 300 companies, and we found that a majority of the companies were from the US and also from other parts of the world. If you would like to know more about this, it's in the IRIS deliverable, which I will reference at the end of my presentation. Then we see there is an active promotion of surveillance solutions in the industry. And the industry is also characterized by a certain lack of openness and transparency. It is hard to find data about some companies who are not very open about who their clients are, what their profits are, and provide very basic information about their actions. Why do we need to look at the surveillance industry and the state? Rachel in the previous session talked about this a bit, and I'd like to go more in detail into this. The reason we need to look at the relationship between the surveillance industry and the state are the most powerful surveillance stakeholders. Now, the state is backed up by legislation, enforcement measures, and policy in terms of the measures it can adopt in relation to surveillance. Industry, on the other hand, develops the solutions, it designs the solutions, and offers the solutions to the state and us. So it is another powerful stakeholder. Now, the other reason we need to look at this relationship is the industry is a very dominant stakeholder and is in a dominant position in terms of the surveillance scenario. Now, though it may seem that the state holds the reins in terms of conducting surveillance, the state is increasingly divesting or letting go of the reins it holds of surveillance in terms of pushing the implementation of surveillance into the private sector. And this we see as in a certain blurring of boundaries is occurring. Both these stakeholders are extremely influential in normalizing surveillance, and this was a point that has been brought out. Surveillance is now being pushed by both these stakeholders as a routine, accepted, and normal part of life. And many of us have just come to accept this. Both of these stakeholders have extremely pro-surveillance agendas, and the state has a strong surveillance agenda because it aims to have social control, it aims to govern, it aims to protect the interests of the governed. On the other hand, the surveillance industry has a strong surveillance agenda because it is a profit-driven industry and a profit-motivated industry, and that's where the money is at the moment. This relationship is also relevant because there is increasingly, as I said, a blurring of boundaries. When public authorities implement surveillance solutions, they often collaborate with the private sector in implementing the solutions. And there is a very gray area as to where one ends and the other begins, and whether one is the agency of the other. And the final and a little troublesome aspect is the hidden nature of these relations. This relationship is a very important relationship, but it is not talked about enough as it should be. And considering that the topic of this panel is democracy, surveillance and democracy, I think it is very relevant to keep in mind the hidden nature of these relationships, the not so obvious facets of the relationship which we often forget to look at. Now, what are the roles of the industry vis-a-vis the state? First of all, the industry is in a position of an educator. That is, I didn't use the word advisor deliberately because I think the industry does more than advise the government. It, in fact, provides information and training sessions, it prepares reports, it puts up position papers, and this wields a lot of influence with government bodies and agencies. Now, in this indirect manner, the industry wields a lot of influence over the state. Then again, the industry is also a needs provider. It supplies, it manufactures surveillance solutions and provides these to the state. Then we also have another aspect of this relationship, and then this refers to the heavy lobbying and advocacy that the industry devotes time and money into pushing the adoption of its surveillance solutions. Then the two collaborate, and this collaboration does not just happen at the buying and selling of surveillance technologies. It also takes place in terms of collaborations that are a little more troublesome in terms of sharing surveillance data and surveillance technologies. Both these stakeholders are involved in what we call the co-production of surveillance, and I think Neela highlighted this before. There is a quiet revolution, he says, where complex new spaces of governing are emerging and where public and private authorities collaborate. Now, the surveillance industry, in the end, also is the validator and implementer of the surveillance technology. So it is, this relationship is a very complex one, and as we can see, has a number of facets to it. Now, but there are some good sides to it. It's not all a bad story, and we do need surveillance. We couldn't do without it, and that's what the normalization of surveillance has been all about. And of course, it provides all these various advantages, which I'm not going to go into at this point. But we have the concerns as well, and these concerns are numerous and varied. I won't go into all these headlines because most of you will be aware of these issues anyway, and you can look them up for yourself. I'll just be brief because of the time limit. So what are the dangerous aspects? First of all, we have the problems with this, with these concerns are we have this role that the state plays. That is, first of all, it is a client of or customer of the surveillance industry. At the same time, it is a policy maker and a regulator. So we see a certain conflict of interest. Well, it might seem like we could do nothing about the situation. Well, it is kind of a catch-22, but the problem with this situation is that because of this conflict of interest, it has a tendency to erode public trust and create more societal vulnerability. Because this, and in fact, this is a tragedy because the whole purpose of surveillance by the state was to lessen societal vulnerability. And The next point is the potential for abuse and function creep and the risks of undemocratic surveillance. Now, democracies, as we have seen, are big users of surveillance technologies. And though we might say that in a democracy there is a greater chance of respect for human rights and civil liberties, we also must acknowledge that there is a potential for abuse and function creep. And there are numerous examples that have been cited in the previous session as well that show that function creeps do occur, and this is possible. And just because it is a democracy doesn't mean we can afford to be lenient in the way we look at this relationship. Third point is the ineffectiveness or incapacity of legal frameworks to regulate the state-industry relationship and its aspects. And we have to recognize the limitation of the law to act in this respect, because as I've said before, the legislator is a part of the state and has a function to kind of protect its own interests. So how does it kind of come to terms with its role and effect? So with the industry becoming, or as I said earlier about the blurring of boundaries between where the state begins and industry ends, or the two are merging together. So who is going to watch over them, and who is watching over the watchers? So we have a number of watchers of the surveillance industry. So we have the government and its various agencies that watch over the surveillance industry. Then we have the civil society organizations, which have a very important role to play. We have the media and we have academia. So yes, we do have the positive influence of all these in looking at the role of the surveillance industry. And what are the effects of these watches? Now, these watches individually by themselves have various motivations. They have various capabilities for action, and they have various effects. And the government, for instance, has a powerful effect on enhancing transparency. It has legislative effects, financial effects, and it does put a certain pressure. It can put a certain pressure on the industry to self-regulate. Civil society also has certain effects, and we can cover this later as well. Okay, so the questions that remain. So if the state-industry alliance is necessary, what we need in the interest of democracy, that is if we are to remain a democracy, is how do we build greater transparency and how do we build more accountability, and what are the levels that should occur? Overall, I would advocate a very cautious approach, and this is because we need the surveillance industry. Let us remember the surveillance industry is one part of the security industry, and this is the one industry that is showing growth in the European economy, and we cannot afford to stifle it. We cannot afford to stifle innovation. So we need to be a bit careful, because there's a lot of jobs going to go if we stifle the industry. So what do we do? But then there is no one size fits all solution, or no one thing we can do about it. So here I have a whole range of measures, and yes, it looks like everything is there. But what we need to do is, I will just focus on the most important, which is in the legal part, we need to create a culture of respect for the rule of law. This I will stress as one of the most important things. In terms of policy, again, we have seen over the course of the 2 days, there are a large number of things we can do, and we are heading in the right direction. So maybe we need to boost efforts in that direction. In terms of the industry, there is a particular point I need to make. Industry associations play a very, very important role in looking after looking after surveillance companies' interests. So maybe other stakeholders could use the power and the clout that these industry associations wield to get some of the surveillance companies to maybe behave in a more ethical manner or in a more socially responsible manner, yes. And finally, we have the media, civil society, and academia. Now, we definitely need a greater role and oversight of the state-industry relationship. And while we know that the media, civil society, and academia do play a very important part, we need a greater awareness of surveillance, of the changing natures of surveillance. And more particularly, I think we need to take it from the surveillance stakeholders' perspective. We need to look at the faces or the or the entities behind surveillance, as in we need to look at it in these terms, more than in terms of just looking at it from the technological point of view. And finally, what we need is greater collaboration between these stakeholders. So we need to rise above the individual limitations of each of these stakeholders and, you know, create forums where we can talk about, where we can debate, where we can push this forward to kind of look into the whole state-industry relationship. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions later.
Okay, then it's Ben. No? Thank you. I think we keep the questions. I'm sure there are a couple of questions. We keep that to the end.
Okay. So just thanks, Reinhard, and the organisers of this panel for inviting me here. I guess the closer we've got to this panel on surveillance and the state and democracy, the more I think I should be talking about the nexus between surveillance, austerity, and protest. The coercion of the poor, the disciplining of the so-called pigs countries through surveillance and technocratic government. But then I thought, you know, people in Brussels don't really care about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about financial surveillance and democracy. And I guess the context for this is that one of the biggest challenges facing democratic countries is surely now, you know, reining in the financial sector, controlling global financial flows, tax avoidance, tax evasion, and dare I say, prosecution of those whose criminal negligence brought Europe to its knees. But I'm not really going to focus on the extent to which our politicians and civil society are rising to that challenge, or not, as the case may be. But I want to just look at the evolution of the global framework for financial surveillance, and some of the implications and some of what we might generously call the unintended consequences. So what am I on about? What is this architecture and where did it come from? Who in this room has heard of the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, or FATF, as my American friends call it? Okay, a handful. So I'm going to tell you a bit about it. It's a little bit technical, but it's kind of necessary for what I want to talk about. The decision to establish the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, was taken by the G7 in 1989. And they set up this body and gave it a mandate to devise a comprehensive framework to prevent the global financial system from being used for money laundering, and to sort of develop recommendations around criminal law, policing, and international cooperation. And FATF, it was sort of extended from the G7 to include the European Commission, a handful of member states. And in April 1990, less than a year after it was set up, it adopted what are now known as the 40 FATF recommendations. Following and the point about this, there was no discussion, no democratic debate whatsoever, and frankly, most people didn't know it was happening. Immediate aftermath of the attacks of 9/11, the FATF's mandate was extended to countering the financing of terrorism, and all the recommendations were revised, and again, there was no sort of public debate whatsoever, probably because it's all so technical. Now, since its formation, the membership and reach of the FATF has dramatically expanded. There's 34 member countries in the original FATF, but there are now 8 regional FATF bodies that replicate what it does around the world. So 180 jurisdictions are now bound by the FATF recommendations. And to make sure they comply, the FATF has come up with some rigorous enforcement mechanisms. First, there is what's called the mutual evaluation process, under which countries are peer-reviewed. And what this means is that every 5 years, teams of inspectors from the World Bank, IMF, FATF, neighbouring states, they go into a country and they rate its compliance with each of these 40 recommendations, and they spell out what must be done to improve compliance where necessary. And these ratings have really now become a central part of the global good governance agenda. In short, developing countries are bending over backwards to obtain good compliance ratings, so they are seen as a safe place for aid, trade, investment, and so forth. And in turn, countries from the global north, the EU, and so forth are pouring in financial and technical assistance to help them comply. And if this isn't motivation enough, the FATF also operates a blacklist of non-cooperating countries and territories, but there's now very few of those: North Korea, Iran, Ecuador, Venezuela, and so on. Now, all of this is important because basically, because of their reach and effect, the FATF recommendations have effectively attained the same status of a global convention, but without any of the trappings of democratic oversight that go with the ratification of this kind of instrument: publicly agreed rules on decision-making, openness, transparency, access to information, and all the rest of it. Okay, so why is this important? Well, this can really be demonstrated by the content and effect of some of the recommendations. Lots of the recommendations concern very obvious things like implementing international conventions on money laundering, organised crime, terrorism, and so forth. But there's also quite a few things that should be of interest to people who care about surveillance and privacy and democracy. I haven't got time to go into much detail, but I just want to focus on 4 of the recommendations that contain some of the most important obligations to which these 180 states are now committed. The first concerns the implementation of what are called due diligence record-keeping systems, and the obligation to report suspicious financial transactions. And these apply to financial institutions as well as designated non-financial businesses. Second one, establish data retention regimes of at least 5 years for all financial transaction records, both domestic and international, as well as disclosure regimes for suspicious financial transactions. Another obligation, establish a financial intelligence unit to receive and disseminate all of these suspicious transaction reports. And another recommendation concerns the prevention of the use of non-profit organisations for terrorist financing purposes. Now, before I go into what I perceive to be the profoundly negative impacts of these measures, it is important to acknowledge that what the FATF has done has certainly helped states identify and prosecute criminals and money launderers and corporate malfeasance and corrupt politicians and so on. But taken together, the FATF recommendations have also opened up the entire financial system to scrutiny by a small and largely unaccountable group of actors, with very little in the way of protection for individuals or organisations. So I just want to make 5 quick observations about the impact of these recommendations. First, the 5-year data retention regime for financial transactions incorporated into EU law under our money laundering regs. This basically reversed the long-standing principle of banking secrecy, but where civil society fought tooth and nail against telecommunications surveillance, it's been pretty much silent on financial surveillance, despite the obvious and highly sensitive nature of this kind of data. And we're sort of now beginning to see what a serious failure this may have been with the introduction of systems like Reddito Metro in Italy, where tax authorities are now able to profile the expenditure of taxpayers against their tax returns. This is a system that's just gone online. Corriere della Sera described it as Stasi-like, and even Mario Monti said it was a ticking time bomb. Second, the obligation to report so-called suspicious financial transactions. This has been augmented by what are called positive disclosure obligations. So in the UK, you work for a bank, you fail to share your suspicions about a certain financial transaction, you could be punished under the criminal law and liable for up to 7 years in prison. So what this has done is generated a phenomenal amount of suspicious transaction reports. In the UK, about 200,000 a year. In the USA, it's about 600,000. What happens to all this data? Well, this is the third point. This gets sent to the financial intelligence units in the transacting states, and there is now a global network of more than 100 FIUs headquartered in Canada, with no meaningful democratic control whatsoever. And just to be clear, the FATF has not only been silent on the kinds of checks and balances and human rights standards that we might need, but they've also directly encouraged what they call flexible and informal cooperation arrangements. Okay, so fourth, in terms of the due diligence and so-called know your customer obligations, the unintended consequences are even more acute. Put simply, the whole package together has introduced a set of obligations that have become so onerous, the entire process of vetting users of financial services has been outsourced to the private sector. And I'll give you one example, and that's a company called WorldChecks. That was founded in 2000, and it was bought last year by Thomson Reuters for $530 million. Now, WorldChecks provides services to more than 4,500 institutions, 49 out of 50 of the world's biggest banks, 200 law enforcement agencies, and many more besides. And what WorldChecks started off doing was consolidating the names on a multitude of national and international sanctions lists, of which there are now more than 300. And the point of doing this was that their clients wouldn't break the law by inadvertently providing financial services to blacklisted individuals or entities. What WorldChecks then started doing was just collecting data on what are called politically exposed persons. That may be where there could be a risk of corruption. Then they started adding to the list, adding to their database, the names of anyone who was convicted of terrorist or money laundering offences. We find that's in the public domain. Then they started adding the names of people who had been named or appeared somewhere as suspects in these kinds of investigations and offences in the FATF mandate. So WorldChecks database now reportedly contains more than 750,000 names, 5,000 new names added every month by a team of 300 people around the world, trawling the ether for terrorist suspects and so forth. Now, needless to say, it is surely, this number, 750,000, is surely substantially higher than the total number of people in the world convicted of FATF offences. But anyway, in the words of WorldChecks founders, the likelihood of anyone on our databases opening up a bank account or obtaining a passport in their own name is extremely slim. Now, to put this in a bit of context, in the UK we're currently debating the legitimacy of a construction industry blacklist of 3,000 trade unionists and health and safety complainants, yet we're silent about a multinational company whose core business is running a dubious blacklist of terrorist and money laundering suspects. The last point that I wanted to make concerns the FATF recommendation obliging states to make sure that their non-profit sectors cannot be abused for the purposes of terrorist financing. And the hypothesis is that, non-profit organisations, NGOs, are a conduit for terrorist financing, so we need strict rules to make sure that this can't happen. Now, in countries like the UK, where we have the Charities Commission and various self-regulatory frameworks, this isn't really a problem. But if you are Burma or Saudi Arabia or Uganda or Russia, and the FATF inspectors come knocking at your door and tell you, hey, guess what? You haven't adequately regulated your non-profit sector. This effectively provides you with a blank check to introduce regulation that can and frequently is being used to restrict, clamp down, or curtail the perfectly legitimate activities of, for example, pro-democracy or human rights organisations. And this throws up another paradox, because post the so-called Arab Spring, the EU and the USA are all about supporting civil society in less democratic countries. But thanks to the regulations drawn up by the bean counters at the Treasury and in the FATF, we're also now in the business of implicitly encouraging the kind of regulations that allowed Russia to kick all foreign NGOs out of the country, or Saudi Arabia to pass a law that requires anyone wishing to set up an NGO to first have permission from the king. So, what you have is this sort of incredible amount of either unintended consequences or failure to address the very real and significant human rights impacts of what's happening. And I would argue that all of this has happened precisely because all of these regulations were drawn up and adopted completely off the radar of civil society, national parliaments and so forth. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. I just want to give a plug for two publications, if any of this was remotely interesting. Legalising Surveillance, Regulating Civil Society, that was a Statewatch TNI publication that came out last year. And keep your eye out for a publication forthcoming in a month or two, A Journey into the Global Blacklisting Industry, also from Statewatch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. To the point, 15 minutes, perfect. Now, to our last presentation, Roger will tell us how we could solve these problems, probably. Here we go.
Thanks very much. My primary role in which I earn my money is as a consultant. I'm a dilettante researcher, and I will use some of the research findings from some of the work I've done in what I'm about to present. But when I thought about it, a lot of the perspective that I'm bringing here is actually my civil society pro bono roles, which are those. So I thought I should declare that at the outset. What I'm going to do briefly is to talk about categories of surveillance and obviously identify the examples of where states are using those kinds of surveillance. I'm going to pick on a mini case of point of view surveillance because it enables me to draw out a few aspects that aren't obvious at a superficial level that require drill down in order to twig to them. I'm going to quickly highlight what we've already established, which is that we do know some principles that should be being applied and which clearly are not. Governance has been failing. And then I'm importantly going to suggest how we go about getting them, because that's really the point at which we should be setting off in this conference. The way in which I perceive surveillance categories to work is like this. Long-standing observational approaches, observation of behaviour, obviously enhanced in various ways. Communication surveillance, going back as far as mail covers for physical mail, moving through all the things we're familiar with in the area of interception. Data valence, of which the financial example has been a lovely example of how things have moved on since I coined that term in 1987. Everything that I talked about then, you've scared me, and I've been doing this for a long time. Location and tracking surveillance I see as a subset of data valence, but it's so critical that I think it needs to be lifted out as its own set of dangers. Body surveillance, which is increasing, and one which we've had to add recently, and many of us are still arguing how we should classify it. I've called it experiential or attitudinal surveillance, and an example here was brought up by Rachel Robinson from Liberty in the last session, because of course data retention captures a great deal more than just traffic in the sense of message traffic. It increasingly captures records of what we've read, which indicates what our interests are, and of course all of the social networking or the various kinds of networking analyses establish our associations. So it's almost reaching towards what we think, but coming from the outside to do it. And of course the increasing extent to which these things are being combined so that we can't just regard them as being independent lines of surveillance. And the state is doing, well, almost all of these things. I just listed some examples to check myself and be sure that yes, the state is doing those things. I thought, don't exaggerate, Roger. I'm always criticised for exaggerating, so let's put some greyed out ones down the bottom that the state hasn't got to yet. Well, implants is pretty close, but experiential attitudinal, well, unfortunately, with data retention arrangements, actually, I'm going to have to make it a fairly dark grey, if not black. The state is reaching into all of these things. I left off number 7, or the sigma, the combination, because at this stage, I don't think there's a huge amount of highly institutionalised combinations, but watch this space, because there'll be lots of money in it. Okay, quickly, to delve through point of view surveillance, what am I in, about a third now? Trying to gauge how deeply I go into this one. We all know what point of view surveillance is. It's the things on the edges of our glasses which are filming you lot so that I can record for my diary what you all look like. And of course I'll use that nonsense of facial recognition software so that I'll know who you are. Well, if you believe that kind of fairy story. But this is the stuff we're talking about. Now there are many further elements from this base that get mixed up in point of view surveillance discussions, because in many cases the policeman's camera is actually here, not here. So point of view of what? Point of view of their chest, I suppose. Person-held devices, cameras of all kinds, held, I can't do this, I have to use a viewfinder, but people who've got the right kinds of eyesight hold their cameras at all sorts of different positions. Point of view, well, it's a point of view, not necessarily that of a human, and of course cameras can be attached to devices as well, and that gets mixed up in the scheme of things. And then I've seen conversations about point of view surveillance technologies which have gone further even to fixed cameras and to somewhat mobile cameras that aren't actually recording a person's point of view. And there's all sorts of enhancements that can be added on, and there's all sorts of combinations, points of view surveillance used by police forces when they've got multiple cameras running from multiple policemen's chests, and so forth. There's an awful lot of ins and outs in here, and an awful lot of good things that can be done with quite a lot of aspects of point of view surveillance. Don't for a moment think I'm an anti-surveillance person. I'm a 43-year information technology industry veteran. I make my money by talking about new technologies. But these technologies have got enormous disbenefits and risks. Disbenefits which are inevitable and risks which may or may not occur, contingent on something. I'm not going to work through these things. It's just a listing of all of the sorts of things that can go bump when you implement these sorts of technologies in different contexts. And some of them can get really quite nasty. Others of them can be more often a little bit comical. They are going to rebound on people. So, what's the scope then for us to keep the uses and particularly the abuses of point of view surveillance by the state under control? Well, if we look at the realities of it, it's not used quite so much yet by social control agencies in the sense of welfare and taxation. It's predominantly used by police in their various forms. And they're blurring, of course, national security agencies and law enforcement agencies as much as they can. And they've got an inherent ability to avoid controls. We do have to give policemen delegations to take actions of a physical nature. It's the way the world works. The world won't work terribly well without it. Privacy advocates argue for that. We've got to take some risks. We've got to trust the police up to a certain point. But we need pre-controls and we need post-controls, and unfortunately we lack them. Magistrates' courts, in many countries, maybe not in your jurisdiction, but certainly in most of mine, don't take a great deal of notice of other people's evidence and take a lot of police evidence, take a lot of interest in police evidence. Of course, the police are often in the position to be providing the only film and, of course, to be able to do it selectively. And independent controls are lacking in most jurisdictions on police behaviour. So now that's all inherent in the way that things work in most jurisdictions. But wait, there's more. This example is from the Commonwealth Statute in Australia, but it mirrors the sorts of things we find in legislation in lots of places. Surveillance Devices Acts weren't actually developed by parliaments or brought forward by public servants in order to regulate surveillance devices. They were brought forward in order to authorise uses of surveillance devices by the state. But they typically start with, thou shalt not do the following things unless. And then there's the rest of the statute is concerned with what the unlesses are. And optical surveillance devices can be used in public places without a warrant under Section 37. Judicial warrants can be readily achieved, advantageous conditions of various kinds across those sections. They can self-issue warrants in particular circumstances. They can do it warrantless in a variety of circumstances. We think there's a few more because of the complexity of the Act and the action or the intersection of that Act with other acts. Hard to work out. And what's more, it expressly can be covert and may even, the use of it may even be able to be suppressed. This is civil stuff. This isn't counter-terrorism legislation. So where are we with controls and governance on this lot? You can just imagine that the Australian Privacy Foundation was called in to consult with the people who framed the Act, can't you? No. We find out afterwards. Okay, that's surveillance down the left-hand side. We all know about surveillance. My apologies for having explanations of French words to a partly francophone audience, but if I use that slide in front of other audiences, I have to explain what sur and sous mean. On the opposite side of things, we've had surveillance as an established concept, I can't remember, early 90s. It's been a practiced thing since the early 80s with Steve Mann's equipment. Google being seen as an innovator for coming up with Google Glasses last year. They are so far behind the pace. This brings a completely different perspective to it. Now, it's not simply that the stuff on the left is bad and the stuff on the right is good. There's a lot of good stuff in surveillance. It can deliver value to society in quite a lot of circumstances, but the excesses, the poorly controlled, the poorly judged, need to be balanced, and surveillance should be able to help us do it, shouldn't it? Maybe. I know David Brin quite well. I've run panel sessions and had David Brin on it because I went and fetched him, and his novels are an awful lot better than the Transparent Society. It's naive as all get out, because it depends. If you're going to, the proposition is that we need to have people watching the watchers. There must be, for every person who is watching screens from CCTV, there must be a camera pointing at that person which is open CTV, visible to other people. It's naive because the powerful won't let you do it. The problems here are that there's a range of things that the state can do to make it difficult for surveillance to be practiced. Now, this is first in principle. What sorts of things could the state want to do? It could actively require a person not to use point-of-view surveillance devices in particular contexts. It could require a person to do something because the policeman said so, such as delete the film you have just taken. It could go further and permit seizure and all of those other things that follow on from seizure, deletion using the policeman's heavy thumbs rather than the owner of the device's thumbs, the infliction of damage, smashing of viewfinders, smashing of lenses, destruction of the device, confiscation and retention. All of those things are possible, but that's scaremongering, Roger. They wouldn't do that, would they? That would be nasty and anti-democratic, wouldn't it? Okay, well, under Australian and New South Wales laws, and I picked New South Wales specifically because A, I'm surrounded by it in the Australian Capital Territory, and B, it's a law and order state. The opposition and the government, which swap from time to time, always both argue on law and order platforms, and therefore I'm bound to find something in the law which I don't like. There was an act for an APEC meeting. There have been, of course, many major events held in Australia, and that act had a sunset clause and it ceased to operate, and that was excellent because it was restricted to a limited space. They were excessive powers, but it was limited in space and time. Unfortunately, thinking that that had been well handled by the Parliament was naive because a different act had already been passed some years ago that nobody really had ever noticed and was revised soon afterwards, which puts New South Wales in the position, New South Wales Police in the position that they can self-authorise effectively for any major event, any minor event, any circumstance in which they think they ought to, and then they can seize and detain anything. And there's not much qualification on the anything. And again, I'm not going anywhere near anti-terrorism laws. The paper on which this is based has a bunch of things that point out several aspects of anti-terrorism laws that add to these things. In other words, once again, we've got a lack of governance and our ability to, as citizens, to adopt countermeasures are seriously constrained. So by delving a bit deeper into some examples, we find that actually the situation's a bit worse than we thought it was at first. Now look, we know all about what we can do about this. If we held a workshop here and said, let's establish a set of principles, let's generalise from all the good things that have been talked about in the previous session and this one, we would end up with a huge amount of agreement, and then we'd haggle over some of the fine wording, and we would endeavour to do this to ensure that good surveillance that is justified, that is serving social purpose, and whose negative impacts are being mitigated by particular design features, got the tick, and got the tick from everybody in civil society who's a sceptic. Those sorts of principles are the sorts of things I put forward in the literature. The design principles need to be expanded, of course, at item 6, but again, these are the sorts of things that we've talked about in particular contexts. The primary area in which I've applied it has been visual surveillance. The CCTV principles that the Australian Privacy Foundation publish is one of the key places. Again, I think we could sit down and do a serious job on this. So what am I saying we should do in order to get governance imposed and achieve something here? Well, Standards have existed for a long, long time. They've got a great history. They've done an enormous amount for things like human safety, delivery of services, sometimes even interoperability and portability, but not necessarily always successful in those areas. Been tremendously valuable. What are the politics of standards? What's happened here? They started out as being individual professionals getting together for the betterment of mankind and one another and industry. Let's do this properly, and they did it. What's happened over a period of time has been that those individuals have less and less acted as individual professionals and more have acted as agents of their employers, funded by them in order to go and make sure that the company gets what it needs. By all means, make it work. If it doesn't work, we won't make money, but make it work, but give us the advantage at least of knowing what's coming, and preferably make the shape of it suitable to the sorts of things we already do. Where do consumers or citizens or representatives and advocates of the public interest sit in all this? Essentially outside it. The APF does not participate in Standards Australia activities. We've said what we need. They will not comply. We will not participate. My experiences with W3C working group were extremely negative, despite my initial attempts to be optimistic about it. It has not worked. We do not have balance in the standards that have been emerging. So some time ago, a couple of years ago, I started proposing that we have got to publish civil society standards documents. We've got to say what these things are that we think are necessary as civil society. It's a counterbalance, it's a voice, and it's got to be authoritative, and it's got to be good. We've got to cross-check one another and keep my extreme adjectives out of the document, for God's sake. We've got to get our act together on these things, and if we do so, we get into a positive position. We get to a stage where we can hammer home the absence of government, and we can do so by arguing from authority. Sure, it's a con. I mean, all arguments from authority are a con, but it's a question of whether you can get away with it or not. And we've not been getting away with it, and we need to. Discussing with Mark Rotenberg over lunch, we floated the possible title of the International Privacy Standards Organisation. We'd like International Standards Organisation, but somebody's taken that. We've got to establish something that sounds right, and then we've got to make sure the credibility is behind it. Each of us have got to check the other and make sure that, that we've said sensible things. And then we can expose and exploit embarrassment through the media in all the normal ways we do. But Caspar Bowden and friends' recent report on the FISA impact on Europe would be further enhanced and further strengthened if it was arguing from a body of principles that was a standard, our standard. And of course, coalitions of interest can be built. We have to build them internally. We can build them externally with other categories of people who've got corresponding interests to ours. And I nearly made it.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. I think I now hand over to Chiara.
Thank you. Thank you to our speakers for their interesting presentations. Before opening the floor to the audience, let me just speak about, well, let me just tell you a few comments about their presentation. First, I think that our speakers, all of them, touched upon dimensions of surveillance and security which relate actually to what has been defined as an unsettled relationship, that is the relationship between surveillance and democracy. And it seems to me that there are a few aspects that emerged. One of them, which I think is crucial, is the issue of proportionality. I think that the legitimacy of surveillance measures rests on their proportionality. So if we consider, for instance, financial surveillance, a question that came to my mind is financial surveillance proportional to the actual threat of terrorism? And then also a second aspect that emerged clearly, I think, is quite a technocratic framework that is sometimes at odds with human rights interest. And furthermore, a top-down approach to security and to the regulation of civil society. So I think my question to all the speakers, and then I leave. We have time for questions, so I leave the microphones to you. So how can we bring back under democratic control surveillance activities? So I was wondering, what's your take on that?
I've made my pitch. Join my international privacy standards organization.
Yeah, thanks, Chiara. There's just one thing I'd like to say. As I said before, there is no one way of dealing with this situation because it has different levels of complexity. In fact, as I was listening to the various presentations and to the themes that were emerging, I think all the different stakeholders, as I said, need to work together. And as you mentioned proportionality and the fact that legitimacy rests upon the proportionality of the measures. But how do we measure proportionality? And are we really thinking about legitimacy when surveillance measures are implemented? Who is supposed to be thinking about legitimacy? Is it, are the corporations really interested in the fact that this surveillance technology is legitimate, or is it going to make me the most, it is going to boost my profits and drive my growth? In fact, I would just propose a simple principle. I mean, it's quite simplistic. I would suggest we use four elements, and that takes into account, and in fact, Roger's principles are excellent because we have a lot to learn from there, and I would suggest, first of all, we use the A, which is avoid surveillance if possible. Then we minimize the effects of surveillance. That is something I think the state can work upon, industry can work upon, and individuals can work upon as well. And then we have the possibility of overcoming surveillance. So at the overcoming level, maybe we have the possibility to objecting, so to surveillance measures and technologies if it is possible. And finally, which is the most important aspect, if surveillance is going to be a facet of life, a normal part of life, and if the other things are not going to work, if it is not possible to avoid surveillance, minimize it, overcome it, or object to it, can we redress it? I think that is the most important aspect, as in maybe forget that perspective, as in surveillance can cause harms, and that is the most crucial aspect to it. So if it causes these harms, there has to be a means to redress and respond to it. So I think we need to develop that aspect as well, yeah, maybe look further into why we ignore elements like legitimacy, which it is very important to talk about in terms of what other kinds of, how can we, is there a universal standard for legitimacy? And that is the difficult question here, because surveillance measures are often implemented at the national level or the local level, and have these cultural beliefs and systems feeding into them, even though we might argue that technologies are neutral.
I hate this bit. I always give these sort of really depressing and sobering surveillance talks. Then someone comes up and says, well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to sort it out? I guess I should have developed an answer after this long. But, you know, I think we've got to, you can't pretend that there's a single answer to all of these different things. And I think the tactics for dealing with something like the financial surveillance system probably rather different for dealing with internet surveillance or for dealing with border surveillance or whatever kind of sectoral approach it is. I love the idea that if we could just all agree some standards, some good privacy standards, everything would be all right. But I think the problem we face is that, you know, we're not the only constituency who wants standards. And, you know, just the stuff I was talking about, it's the fact that, you know, the international community has developed a set of standards. Thanks. Has developed a set of standards, you know, for combating money laundering and countering terrorist financing, you know, that have become this international norm that no one's really challenged. They've been there now for 20 years. And sort of nascent attempts to roll these back. You know, it's pretty complicated and depressing stuff in a way. So anyway, I'll stop there and see if there's any more questions.
Charles?
Is this on? Yeah. Thanks to all the presenters. I thought they were all an awful lot of good stuff to say. I wanted to, in terms of, you know, where do we go from here and what the answer is, pick up one of Rowena's slides where you talked about the four things, and you had government and civil society and the media, and I forget what the fourth one was. And it seems to me that you need to unpack and, in a sense, disaggregate particularly your government thing, because we have a kind of fuzzy notion of a thing called the state, and we have Statewatch, of course. But under the state, I suppose, comes government and parliament, and you had regulators in there, and so forth. And it's very easy to say, well, the state, wills surveillance into being and uses it and so forth. But in fact, if you look at that constellation, you find, in fact, opposition and possible leverage and possible regulation and so on. Now, it doesn't mean that there's some automatic solution in there, but putting the best face on it, you could say there are opportunities for improving regulation, indeed. I know that David Flaherty said that data protection laws legitimize surveillance rather than controlling it, but some data protection laws do it, regulate better than others, and there have been some victories amongst all of these sort of defeats and inadequacies and so on. And it seems to me that maybe incrementally and bit by bit, and of course it's a kind of moving target, because as soon as you think that you've regulated one form of surveillance, then another one, this omni, whatever it is, pops up again, and you've got to start the ball game over again. But I think that we need to kind of look at the opportunities that are possible amongst the range of institutions, and that's the same for the other ones, for the media and so on. Some of the media, in fact, amplifies surveillance, and some of it tries to criticize it. So, we have to look at that a bit more carefully and find opportunities for strengthening what might bring surveillance under some sort of control.
Yeah, there's a question there, and here.
Hey, we've been thinking quite a long time about surveillance now, and the interesting sort of new avenue when talking about surveillance in democracy is very much surveillance and prosecution, subsequent prosecution, happening cross-border. We see that, for example, in the prosecution of those involved with WikiLeaks. Several Europeans are involved, thinking that their rights are sort of protected under EU law, but in the meantime they're prosecuted in the United States. So I wondered what your thoughts are on surveillance and cross-border democracy and how we should approach that. I mean, that's quite a complicated new avenue of sort of surveillance and democracy.
We take the last question, I think, because we are running. There are two questions. Okay, then time is over, I'm afraid.
I'm having a question. If you look from the practical law perspective, the state is a quite rich defendant. And if you bring case against the state and require state liability for privacy breach, and in surveillance cases, sometimes you have a very good material for this. Not only police, but it is published on YouTube and so on. How much, in your opinion, such litigation cases may force police, for example, to a little bit consider their practices and to improve their practice in respect, for example, those public surveillance practices in streets and so on?
I just wanted to take up the suggestion of a professional group to establish standards in privacy and surveillance. And I've had a chance with my former employer, Microsoft, over 9 years to see the standards making process up close from the perspective of the IT industry. And generally speaking, standards work when you have a group of commercial players with some common interests to resolve, and they can try and negotiate to achieve some trade-offs and an optimum position. Now, the problem, as we know, with privacy is that privacy has very few friends among institutions and organizations, and there's a lack of collective agency to make the individual interest in privacy come to the fore. So I can remember 10 years ago, for example, Europe through CEN did try and engage industry for part of what was then a privacy standards exercise. And I saw at first hand how industry gathered round to sabotage that initiative and make sure it went nowhere. And I do think it's much more promising, the approach of essentially a group of professionals who respect each other to come together and essentially make up their own standards. And I don't think, from my experience of privacy standardization failures, that this should be tied to existing law necessarily. In some ways, I think, whether you're looking at European data protection law or the Byzantine fragmentation of US law, the system is broken in law. We'd be much better off as professionals essentially knowing where the shortcuts have to be taken, knowing where, if you like, the optimum spot cannot be achieved in law, but maybe can be achieved through us setting our own standards. That might be a fruitful approach. But maybe we should not then call it standards, because anything which is associated with the cesspit of the standards-making process at the moment is, I think, unwise.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that, on the questions?
No, I mean, I was just, I guess the question you raised about the, international surveillance or cross-border surveillance. I mean, that to me is probably the biggest challenge we face. It's the internationalization of security, for want of perhaps a better term, and the fact that so many of the key decisions are now taken in international fora or at international, within international structures that are completely beyond the traditional system of democratic checks and balances that we once had. Shall I carry on or shall I stop? Should we just stop? Okay.
We started 5 minutes late, so we should have 2 minutes over 6 o'clock.
If you sort of look back to European Union cooperation, say 10, 15 years ago, there was an attempt to kind of formalize this sort of international police cooperation stuff. We had mutual legal assistance conventions, we had detailed mechanisms for information exchange, and then what happened, the law enforcement and security agencies just said, this is crap, it's far too cumbersome, we need a new flexible framework, and suddenly, out of the window went mutual legal assistance, in went, international state-to-state informal networks, the PRUM Convention, spontaneous exchanges of data, and we've gone backwards. We had better regulation of international policing 20, 30 years ago, or it took place on a much smaller scale than we do now. And I just reining in some of these bodies, and I'd include the European Union working parties and expert groups and all the rest of that, within that is probably the biggest challenge we face in Europe if you're serious about, getting a grip on surveillance stuff.
Yeah, do you want to go? Yes.
I'll just address your question about, you asked the question of whether litigation would impact, say, surveillors. So I'll take this from two aspects. I'll take it in the case of the police, as you said, and I'll take it in terms of what I've seen as how it affects the surveillance companies. So in terms of the police, I think, I do know we have a very negative view of the law, as in the law is very slow moving in terms of technology. But when the law hits, it does hit hard. So I think litigation will have an impact. In terms of when there is a case, and say if the case is won, say if the subject of surveillance wins a case against someone who is surveilling it, it would have an impact on the person who was conducting the surveillance, because they would be required to reassess their methods of surveillance. They would probably put in place appropriate policies and maybe set up some standards, and this has happened. I won't talk about the effectiveness of those standards, that is another thing altogether, or they might find another means of circumventing what was decided, or come up with another way of getting around it. Now, in terms of the surveillance companies, I mean, during the course of my research in the IRIS project, I kind of looked at loads of annual reports of companies, and yes, they are very much concerned about being litigated against. And they have put in place policies after there have been cases against them. So I think litigation would be quite effective way of hitting them, because if somebody wins damages against a surveillance entity, an entity who's conducting surveillance, and it hits them hard, as in it causes them a particular loss. In some cases, there are some companies, I won't name any, that have in fact experienced problems in terms of their monetary situation because of maybe the case law that's affecting them, because fighting a case is an expensive proposition, and defending a case is an expensive proposition as well. So it does hit hard. So in terms of the companies, yes, I think litigation is an effective measure. But as I said, there's always another side to the story. So.
Okay, they're not going to give me time to answer those other questions. I'll just have the parting shot. We've just formed the International Privacy Something organisation, IPSO, and the person who doesn't like the word standards as S has agreed to be secretary, and his first job is to work out what the hell it stands for if it's not standards.
Okay, thank you, Roger, and let's give a big hand to our presenters here. And, you made it through the day, and you deserved an aperitif over there at the big hall. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.